My phone slipped out of my hand and hit the linoleum. It spun, face up, the screen still alive for a moment, glowing like a little window, and then it showed me a life I didn't recognize. There she was, my girl, in a white dress that could have been spun from sunlight, a veil tucked under her chin, smiling as if I had stood there beside her. The caption read something ordinary, something sharp. Best day ever. A line of likes, a dozen hearts, not one of them mine. The coffee cup trembled in my other hand. Pecan Danish crumbs fell on the table like tiny accusations. I sat down very slow, as if my knees might give, and the floor would tell me the truth before my mouth could speak it. For 67 years, I'd learned to hold my breath in the kitchen when life surprised me. That morning, the surprise was a photograph somebody else posted so easily that it didn't even occur to them I might want to know. Hope married without telling me. I found out the same way a stranger would, on the internet. If you're listening and you've ever learned a thing that changed you by seeing a little glowing square, you know the sensation. The world rearranges itself, and you have to pick up the pieces and decide where you fit in the new arrangement. Have you ever learned life-changing news from social media? Drop one word in the comments if this reaches you. I raised hope by myself. That is a line I say now like a creed and like an explanation. No husband, no steady hand to divide the nights. Just me, cleaning other people's homes, sewing when there was rent to be met, stirring a pot for one, then two, then one again, teaching Hope to tie a bow and to tell the truth even when it hurt. She was small enough to fit on my hip, stubborn enough to win arguments with a door shut. When she had pneumonia at 7, I sat up all night and read the Bible we kept for emergencies. But I never called it a miracle when she finally breathed easy. I called it stubbornness and good medicine. When she graduated, I stood in the back wearing the hat that never fit right and felt like my ribs might break with pride. There are photographs of those nights in a wooden trunk under the bed in the spare room. The lid has a strip of tape across the corner and the tin scent of old rain. Birth certificates, hospital bracelets, a pink letter folded into quarters that Hope wrote to me when she was 18. Mama, I'll always call you. I'll always need you. I opened that trunk after the photograph because I needed to see what my life had meant when a stranger's wedding post could make me feel invisible. The pink letter smelled faintly of lavender. She had scribbled in a rush. College, dreams, a promise. The promise was a thing I had carried like a talisman for years. You hang on to a child's promises in the same way you hang on to warm clothes in winter. They keep you believing there is a spring coming. But promises change form. People change. And sometimes they don't tell you. At first I thought it was an oversight. Hope had been distant the way a moon is distant, visible, predictable, but not always close. There were dinners she missed, texts that took days to answer, Thanksgiving plans rearranged because Devon's parents wanted to host. There were little slights, a remark about painting the magnolia room, a little old-fashioned, a photograph of her with unfamiliar friends where she looked like a woman carved from someone else's expectations. I told myself these were small things. Mothers are good at shrinking big hurts into something manageable. Then came the photograph. I called and called. The phone went to voicemail. I left messages that sounded like my heart, choked, then steady. Baby, are you all right? Call Mama. A week later, there was a muted thumbprint of silence where a daughter should have been. Auntie Rosa rang me the next afternoon with her practical voice. Child, you spoiled her, you know. Now she said it like it was arithmetic. You can't spoil someone into thanking you. Auntie Rosa has been that way my whole life, sharp with the truth, soft with the remedy. She reminded me of the basics. Find out what you own, name what you need, make a plan. You got to stop waiting on people to invite you into your life, she said. You do the inviting for yourself. The thing about being a single mother and a single woman in my 60s is that the world expects you to have waited your whole life for the kindness of others. I had not always been content with that expectation, but it had become a rhythm. I woke to iron the collars of someone else's shirt. I learned to patch the knees of another gardener's child because they paid me in trust. I sewed Hope's button-downs until I could hardly remember my own name. I did it gladly for years, but gratitude is a small coin. When it doesn't come, the account balance starts to look different. The days after the photograph blurred into a kind of slow-motion ache. I found Hope's pink letter, then the trunk of photographs. Sunday Mass at St. Jude's with her crooked hat, our first stew together. A snapshot of her with a toy crown she drew herself. I touched each photo like it might spring to life if I asked it nicely. I read the letter until the ink had the same softness as my breath. "Call me," I wrote in a note of my own, and left it on the kitchen table like an offering. It sat under the pecan Danish box other people had brought by because they'd heard. People were kind. Strangers were kind. Hope was something else. At home you learn to speak in riddles so as not to get hurt. I told nobody that day how tight it felt at my throat, how small the house seemed when I walked from room to room. I put on my good shoes, and I went to the bank. Mr. Fernando Lawson at Peachtree Savings knows the sound my life makes. I've seen him in the soft light of the teller's window more than once. He has an easy manner for reasons I can't measure. Maybe bankmen get used to steady things. He poured me a cup of bad coffee, and we sat at a small table near the window, where you could see the dogwoods lean like old women gossiping. "Do we have a plan?" he asked. I wanted to say I lived on plan, hope and hustle, 2 hands and a prayer. Instead, I said what was practical. "I have some savings," I told him. "I have this house. I think it's time I stopped holding my breath for a phone call." He leaned forward and did the thing a banker does. He mapped out numbers on a napkin, turning them into steps and timelines. "Do you have a concealed savings account?" "Yes." "Investment bonds?" "A little." "Home equity?" "Enough to matter." He spoke of interest and rates, and how the proceeds might support my move into a place with meals and a community where people remembered birthdays, and where the gardens were tended for you when your knees started to complain. "You're absolutely within your rights if the deed is in your name," he said, quiet but clear. "You've spent your life making sure things don't fall apart. You deserve a life where they don't." That phrase, "within your rights," settled in me like a small medicine. Legal authority is not the same as moral authority, and yet sometimes they're neighbors. I thought about Hope's hands when she was 4, sticky with jam. I thought about all the times I had put myself last because the world told me mothers were supposed to. The idea of moving into the legacy at Peachtree had been something I'd dismissed when I was strong enough to haul another person's washing machine up 3 flights. "That's for folks who have run out of children," I used to say with a laugh that wasn't as light as it pretended. But the practicalities had been lodging themselves in my head like a persistent seed. I toured the place on an overcast Tuesday, with Patricia at the front desk smiling like she had an answer for everything. The legacy smelled faintly of lemon polish and bakery bread. Folding doors, a balcony where a woman in a purple cardigan knitted something the color of early morning, a common room where residents played dominoes, and the pictures on the walls were people smiling because they had been given time to do it again. A woman named Mrs. Eleanor took my hand and said, "We saved you a space, honey, whenever you want it." I told her thank you and meant it, not because anyone had saved it for me, but because I was the one to take the reservation. A lawyer is a different sort of comfort. Michael Sanders sat behind his desk with a file open and a pen I could trust. He had a handshake like it was a promise he's kept too. "You own the property in full?" he asked. I told him the truth. Title in my name, mortgage long paid, the house older than a lot of things in my life, but still standing. He explained how to update a will, how to set conditions if I wanted to use one, what it would mean to designate distributions, and set aside funds for a charitable gift. There was a kind of poetry to legal language, clear, severe, and oddly consoling. "You can require a reflection, a letter if you'd like," he said when I mentioned the pink letter and how it had been a promise. "You can make that part of your estate plan. It must be reasonable, but it's permissible." So I wrote the first line of a new plan on a notebook page I had labeled months ago, in a handwriting that had the same loops and courage as when I had taught Hope to form her name. Plan for independence. 1. Tour residence. 2. Consult bank. 3. Update will. 4. List house. There's a date I didn't initially write down. I let the pen hover, letting the date find me. It is a funny thing how a decision simplifies the noise in a house. Once you decide, the clutter takes on the shape of the plan. My dishes felt like allies instead of evidence. The sewing machine sat less accusingly. I emptied the wooden trunk and spread the contents on the bed like an offering. Birth certificates, photographs, the pink letter folded thin as a prayer. I found Hope's first pair of ballet shoes, dusted them, and put them in a box labeled Memories. I did not make that plan as a punishment for Hope. I made it because I realized I'd been postponing myself for so long that I had forgotten who I was, besides a fixture in someone else's life. There is a dignity to choosing yourself that is not the opposite of love. It is its own brand of tenderness. Still, the sale of the house felt like closing a door I'd once kept open for a child who might come back through it. Saying aloud that I would list it made something inside me ache. The house held winters where we bundled under quilts, the smell of baked mac and cheese on Sundays, the echo of a small voice learning multiplication tables on the stairs. I had painted the magnolia room in a shade Hope liked, once when she was 12 because she said it matched her eyes. Her name was up on a doodled chore chart that had never been used. These were not petty things. They were the architecture of a life. I sat on the front steps and let the porch light pool around me. The magnolia tree's shadow made lace on the pavement. Across the street, a neighbor hung wind chimes that sounded like glass laughter on the breeze. I thought about the legal right to do what I had to do. I thought about Hope's silence and Auntie Rosa's practical counsel, and the nights spent mending other people's shirts while mine went unstarched. When I went back inside, I wrote a letter to Hope. Not the kind that demands an explanation or piles guilt on someone, but a letter that described what had happened in plain English. I learned you were married by seeing a photograph online. I felt excluded. I thought about my choices. I decided to move. I have sold the house. This last line I hesitated over longer than the rest, because there are certain truths that feel like dropping a stone into a pond. Ripples go farther than you expect. I did not mail that letter. I left it folded in my trunk under the pink letter, the one she had written me at 18. 2 pieces of paper on 2 ends of a life. One was a promise. The other was an honest ledger. The house went on the market by a smart woman in real estate named Lillian, who promised me she would treat the photographs with respect. "We'll highlight the original hardwoods and the magnolia room," she said. "People like that if you keep the home feeling lived in." We left it so. She took pictures that made dust look like character, and the living room looked like it had been air-kissed. A sign went up in the yard that afternoon while I stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea cooling at my elbow. A neighbor asked how I felt, and I told her what was true, a little frightened, a little relieved. She patted my hand the way neighbors do when words will not stand up straight. There are small legalities that comfort you. Lillian brought the listing agreement and explained the commission in a way that made sense. She asked me to sign. I read every line because that's what life has taught me. Read every line. Sign when you understand. That morning I signed. Next came the meetings with Mr. Sanders to begin the paperwork for an estate update, an addition that included a condition I wanted. Hope would be able to inherit a portion if she wrote a letter reflecting on our relationship and what had happened, a request less about control than about conversation. "It's not revenge," I told Mr. Sanders. "It's a chance for a conversation I never had." If she can't do that, I want the funds used partly for a community program I care about. He nodded, making notes like a man carving a map for me to follow. Conditioned bequests are acceptable, he said. They mustn't be punitive, and they must be reasonably attainable. A reflective, written statement is an example of something a court could uphold if written sensibly. Why, he even suggested wording gentle enough that it wouldn't feel like a trap. A letter reflecting on your relationship with the decedent, expressing understanding and acknowledgement of the circumstances surrounding her final years. We rewrote it until it sounded less like an ultimatum and more like an invitation. Sometimes structure helps people say what they mean, he said. I left the lawyer's office with copies of an updated will and the sense that I had done something responsible. Mr. Fernando at the bank organized the proceeds in a way that would provide for my move and set aside a fixed amount for charitable gifts to the food pantry where Auntie Rosa volunteers. I put my signature to the paperwork that would release the title once an offer came that matched our expectation. The house belonged to me, legally, wholly. It had for a long time. That was a fact that sat alongside the ache. Facts and feelings can exist in the same room and stare at each other politely, and then you get on with what must be done. On the day the offer came, it felt like the house exhaled. Lillian called me with the kind of voice realtors have when something closes. A family, she said. They loved the Magnolia Room. They wanted to put down a fair chunk for earnest money. We discussed repairs and dates. I signed more documents. My signature was the same as it had been on Hope's first report card. You feel a kind of vertigo the first time you sign away something that has been a promise in your life. It is not a crime to feel small. After the offer was accepted, there is a lull that sits like a held breath. You look about your life to see which treasures you must carry, which you must let go. I packed the ballet shoes, the pink letter, the photo of Hope with jam on her cheek. I put in a box the wooden trunk's lock, broken now from years of use, and taped it shut with the careful hand of someone who has packed their heart into a moving van before. There was one more signature left, the closing. They scheduled it for a Tuesday, which seemed fitting. Ordinary days are the ones that carry the biggest changes. Mr. Sanders would have the papers typed. Mr. Fernando would be there for the funds transfer. Lillian transported her clipboard like a general. I had imagined the scene in my head 100 times. It was everything I thought it would be, and not enough. At the closing table, the documents were spread like scripture. The deed, the transfer of title, the settlement statement with numbers that made sense in their tally. I took a breath because the air tasted like wine that hasn't opened yet. My hands were steady. They had to be. When my pen hit the line and the ink dried, there was a thin, almost audible click in my chest, the closing of a lock, the settling of a hinge. Lillian smiled in the way people smile when a business comes to its end and begins something else. Mr. Fernando shook my hand not so much as a banker, but as someone who watches people change their course. Mr. Sanders folded his hands and said, "You did everything correctly, Ms. Harrison. The transaction is clean and lawful. The proceeds are set aside as you specified." I walked out of that office with a small envelope of keys in my pocket, keys that would no longer open the house where I had raised Hope. The envelope felt heavier than it should. I held it like a relic, and then I placed it carefully in the wooden trunk before I closed the lid. For a long time I stood in the hallway and let the quiet of the house be the witness to a choice I'd made. I did not call Hope immediately. I thought of dialing and saying, "I sold the house." I imagined the sound that would come back, shock, hurt, something I would have to hold without flinching. Instead, I made coffee and stood on the back stoop while a moving truck idled 2 doors down, the driver taking long, efficient drags of his cigarette. The pecan Danish was gone now, eaten by a neighbor who said she couldn't watch me sit in my sorrow alone. I sipped the coffee, and the steam fogged the air between me and the magnolia tree. That evening, I drove by the Legacy at Peachtree. Lights were on behind the windows. A couple of residents sat under a covered porch and fed a wooden-eyed squirrel that wasn't shy about its ambitions. I thought of what it would be to sip coffee on that balcony, to have someone bring me a plate without me asking, to join a quilting group that swapped laughter like pattern pieces. The idea of being cared for in practical ways did not feel like surrender anymore. It felt like an acceptance of a different kind of love. I placed the pink letter back on top of the trunk, as if to say to that younger me and to the younger Hope, "This is our record. Read it and tell me what you see." The last thing I did that night was write another letter, this one not for Hope, but for myself. I am choosing myself now. I am not abandoning you. I am securing a life where I can breathe. If you have sat at a table with papers that change everything, you know the mixture of relief and rawness that follows. Some days it is all relief. Some days it is a tide of questions. The sale was lawful, the steps were careful, and yet nothing about it felt small. It felt monumental in the way the world instructs the elderly to be invisible until they make a choice to be seen. I went to bed that night with the television unlit and the house quiet in a way that felt like a held note. Somewhere in the dark, a clock measured the passing of a life that had worn its patience as a garment. I slept like the sea, not flat, but with tides that rose and fell. I had not expected the next morning to be loud. I had not expected a knock at the door. But the world keeps moving even when you think you have set the terms. The ring of the bell made my heart start quicker than any photograph ever had. I opened the door, and there they were, Devon with a suitcase and Hope behind him, smiling the tentative smile of people who have come back to a place they think they left well or badly, their eyes darting around as if looking for proof that home still exists. Hope looked like someone who'd rehearsed the things to say on the drive over. Her hand went up as if to touch my face and then fell. Devon set the suitcase on the porch as if it were heavier than it should be. Both of them were quiet for a second that felt painfully long. "Mama," Hope said, and the use of that word folded like a memory into the air between us. "I invite you to sit here with me a moment and imagine the weight of everything stacked in that doorway. The sale inked, the trunk closed, the photograph still bright on someone's feed. Decisions make small worlds reorganize. I put out my hand and asked them in because there is a civilization called manners, even for difficult confessions. We sat with the coffee cooling between us. Devon's eyes were kind but uncertain. He kept glancing at me as if I might be fracturing at the edges. Hope kept her hands folded in her lap like she could hold herself together with them. I watched her chest rise and fall, and I thought of the many nights I'd sat awake worrying about her breath. "What happened?" Devon asked finally, the simple question that was also an opening. What I told them in that doorway was true. I told them how I found the photograph. I told them how I had called and not heard. I told them the truth about the notebook and the bank and the lawyer and the updated will. I told them that yes, the house had been sold, that the sale had been lawful, that some funds had been set aside for charities that mean something to me. And yes, there was a condition in my will that asked for a reflective letter. Hope's face changed in a way that reminded me of her childhood, an honest, unpracticed expression. Her voice was small. "Mama, I didn't know. Devon and we meant to tell you. It was—" She stopped. Devon reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. There are moments when the world asks you to judge another's motives, and I refuse. Motives are knotted, complicated things. Fear, shame, the hunger to start a new family identity, the worry about how approval will look. I have been young, and I have made poor choices. I have also been forgiven. I wanted to offer that same space to her, yet I had to stand where I had placed myself, steadier, quieter, and no longer willing to be a house that waits. We talked. Their words circled around mine, apologetic and urgent and a little helpless. Hope said things that sounded like a script she'd rehearsed on the way over, apologies and explanations that tried to stitch the photograph into a history where my presence was an assumed actor. Devon apologized for the hurt caused. He told me softly that he had not meant to keep secrets. He said things a man says when he hears the sound of someone else's sorrow. I listened with the kind of attention that is a kind of gift and a kind of test. When Hope's voice cracked and she said, "I wanted to protect you," the old instinct to mother her rushed up, an urge to soothe and fix. But I had done that my whole life. I had taught her how to be protected and how to protect herself. Now she had to learn how to include me or to accept my absence. The line between being available and being a doormat is a fine one that mothers learn to walk in private. When they left the porch that afternoon, there was a silence that followed like a prayer unfinished. They didn't slam the car door. They didn't leave with all the tenderness back in their pockets. There was a charged quality, an expectation that something would happen now that the sale was official. I had taken a radical step, not out of malice, but out of an honest attempt to secure my years. After they drove away, I sat at the kitchen table with the wooden trunk open and the pink letter visible on top. I took out the envelope with the house keys and held it for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph would be too loud. I felt like someone who had crossed a river and found the other bank had a different sky. There are things you can plan and things you cannot. The legalities were managed. The sale was clean. The will was updated with a clause that was more invitation than demand. But the human work, the mending, the explaining, the calluses of old habits, was another sort of labor. I knew, with a clarity that settled into my bones, that selling the house had changed the terms of our relationship. It forced a reckoning that might be gentle and might be painful. I decided then that I would not be the person who multitasked her grief into anger and called it wisdom. I would be honest. I had been hurt. I had been excluded. I had chosen myself because I could no longer afford to wait for someone to remember me. That last part felt scandalous in a way that does not belong to me anymore. Choosing yourself can smell faintly of selfishness, the world says. But sometimes it smells like lavender and the right kind of bread. I took another slow breath and reached for the notebook labeled Plan for Independence. In the margin, next to Tuesday's date, I wrote one line, balcony coffee, a small, gentle promise. It was a tiny thing to anchor me. Small promises build the future. When I closed the trunk and placed the pink letter atop it, the house seemed to inhale and then to settle. The sale had happened. That was fact. The consequences had begun to unfurl, but they hadn't come to a neat end. There would be conversations, possibly reconciliation, perhaps not. There would be visits to the legacy at Peachtree, afternoons of new friendships, dominoes played in low voices. There would also be nights when the photo would float back like a ghost, and I would look at the back of my hands and see the map of a life. At the end of that day, I stood on the old porch, the air warm as a bath, and watched the magnolia leaves shiver in a wind that felt like change. I held the envelope of keys in my hand, and then, slowly, I put it back in the trunk. The house had been part of our story, but it did not contain the whole of me. I set the notebook into the glove compartment of my car with a care that felt ceremonial. There are more pages to fill. There are more signatures to make. Closing was done, but it was only the beginning of how the story would unfold. I made a pot of sweet tea, fetched a chair for the porch, and sat until the batter of cicadas made a kind of applause. I decided I would wake up tomorrow and start packing the small things that mattered. I would call Auntie Rosa and tell her about the sale, and she would say, "Good girl," and I would believe her. I sat there and let the smell of magnolia and tea stitch the day into something softer. Hope's picture existed in a corner of the world now, without me in it, but that did not mean I wouldn't be part of her world still. I had made a lawful, deliberate choice to sell the house. I had done it for my dignity, for security, and for the quiet hope that sometimes people will meet you again when they see you standing steady. I had set a condition in my will not to trap, but to invite honest conversation. I had packed the trunk and set a date on my notebook. Outside, the street lamp flicked on like a slow wink. Inside, the photos kept their poses, and the pink letter waited under the lid. The next chapter was not yet written, and that was both frightening and freeing. I poured another cup of coffee and turned a page in the notebook. There are some decisions you make that change the weather of your life. This was one of them. The first night in my new room at the Legacy at Peachtree, I woke at 2 and listened to the building breathe. It was a different breath than the house had taken. The house had been the slow inhale and hush of years. Here, the sound was a genteel rhythm of pipes and quiet footsteps, and the distant hush of a television playing somebody's favorite gospel choir. I lay there and let the ceiling fan sketch lazy circles in the dark. For a long time, I counted the familiar things. The pink letter in the wooden trunk, it still fit into the trunk. The envelope with keys tucked inside as if they were boiled with all the old mornings. The notebook slid into the glove compartment, and the loose date on the page that now read, "Balcony Coffee." Those were small anchors in a sea that had shifted under my feet. Morning arrived with sun like satin across the balcony cushions. I wrapped my hands around a chipped mug Patricia had given me. The Legacy's china was thick and warm, the kind you could hold when your fingers wanted to remember names. The balcony looked out over a courtyard where azaleas had been planted in rows like little promises. Mrs. Eleanor, in her purple cardigan, waved from below. She'd taken a liking to me like some women do to strangers who look like they might enjoy a shared story. "Coffee?" she asked, as if she hadn't seen my mug already. "Come down and join us after you feed the birds." I fed the birds metaphorically by scattering a few crumbs, and then went down to join a couple of women and a man who introduced himself as Mr. Alexander Davis. He had a laugh that sounded like a tenor saxophone and a way of listening that made you think he had practiced paying attention for most of his life. Mrs. Mercedes brought a plate of Pekin Danish, just one, warm and browned in the edges, and set it between us while Mrs. Eleanor told somebody about the quilting circle that met on Thursdays. It felt absurd and tender that something as simple as a Danish could make me feel like I belonged in the world again. There are shapes to beginning over. The first week I learned the routine: morning coffee on the balcony, midday activities, exercise, then a lecture or gardening, and evenings in the common room. I sat in on a knitting group one afternoon and found that my hands, used to mending shirts and patching knees, remembered the rhythm of cast-on stitches. Mrs. Mercedes taught me how to do a simple pattern, and then showed me, with the ease of someone who had given away more than she kept, how to make the edge neat. I used to measure success by whether Hope had clean socks to wear. Now I measured it by whether my scarf came out even. Auntie Rosa came down to visit the first weekend. She marched into the Legacy like a woman who had been sent by the post office of good sense. Her hat sat straight and sensible on her head, and she had, in her handbag, a supply of stern greetings and a container of stew she insisted I keep in the freezer. "You did good," she told me the first afternoon, sitting on a floral couch and taking my hand as if to make sure the decision had stuck. "You did good. People think they're doing you wrong, but sometimes they are only doing their own lives. You don't have to carry theirs anymore." We talked about hope in the sort of hush voices people use when they speak about a younger person who has stumbled and not yet learned to get up without help. Auntie Rosa, sharp and unromantic about motives, spoke plainly. "She married. That doesn't mean she hates you. It might mean she is clumsy trying to find her place. But you, child, you made a plan." She tapped the notebook that now resided in my bedside drawer. "You got yourself a plan, and plans save people who are most at risk of being forgotten." It felt miraculous, in an ordinary way, to be affirmed for choosing myself. There is no scripture for the dignity of packing a trunk, but there might as well be. On my second Wednesday, I took a walk with Mr. Davis and listened to him tell me about his old life. A carpenter by trade, a widower who had built more than one porch and learned how to mend a fence in a single day. He told me about a girl he used to know who loved magnolia trees and the way they smelled in April. When he spoke of love, there was no grand-waisted rhetoric, only the steady remembering that humans are stores of small affections. It was comforting to know another person in the building had kept a private ledger of losses, too. The house sale had created some ripples I didn't expect. Word travels in small towns and in neighborhoods like this, even when you're in a city. Some neighbors stopped me on the street and told me they were proud, or that they'd known it was time, or that they were sorry I had been hurt. Others asked for the price as if it made any difference to the weight inside my chest. Lillian sent a card and a photograph from the new family who lived in the Magnolia Room now. I kept the card on the small side table and thumbed the picture sometimes when the ache returned. Hope began to call more regularly, though not at first as candidly as I wanted. She started with texts, clumsy, short, cautious. "Mama, can we talk?" And then, "I'm sorry," and later, "Would you like to get coffee?" The first time she called, I let it ring and did not answer. It was a test of my resolve, silly and necessary. When I finally picked up, she sounded like someone trying to fix a broken vase with tape. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quickly, words pouring out as if she feared I'd change my mind mid-sentence. "We were overwhelmed. Devon's family. It got messy. I should have told you. I'm so sorry." "Thank you for apologizing," I said. I kept my voice even. I wanted the apology to be real. Rushed remorse is often a bandage. "You're not a child anymore. We will do this like adults. We'll talk. But I can't be the house that waits for you to remember me." Some conversations were merciful. Some were not. Hope, when she came to see me, brought Devon with a suitcase as before, but there was a different air, more openness and less rehearsal. We sat in the visitors' lounge where plants preferred the boundary of windows, and people could not imagine that anything private would stay that way for long. Hope handed me a folded piece of paper at the end of her second visit. A letter, shorter than mine had been, and more raw. She said, "I tried to write what you asked for. I'm not there yet, Mama, but I'm trying." I read it slowly. In it, she spoke of shame. Shame at not including me. Shame at how she had wanted to start a new life and didn't know how to do it without erasing the old. She admitted fear, that my reaction would be to cling, to demand, to come back like a tide that didn't memorize the shore. She wrote about Devon, about the nervousness of introducing me to his family, and the odd pressure that made her make choices on the fly. Most of all, she wrote about the discovery that love and duty were not always the same thing. Sometimes love wandered into fear and hid. "I meant to tell you," she wrote, "and then 1,000 small things made me keep that door closed. I'm sorry. I hope, when you're ready, you'll let me be in your life in whatever way you'll have me." It was a start. It met the letter condition in spirit, and Mr. Sanders, after a careful look, told me it likely met the legal test I'd asked him to draw up: reasonable, reflective, and not punitive. For a while there was a strange tug-of-war inside me between wanting to accept her word and wanting to keep my new boundaries intact. What I wanted, ultimately, was a relationship that rested on mutual respect. The letter was one piece of that scaffolding. Auntie Rosa kept me honest. "Girl, if she's writing, don't make it a bridge you burn on purpose," she said over a bowl of stew. "But you ain't nobody's fool either. You have to call your own plays." She knew me well enough to say both things at once, the kindness and the caution. So I began, in small ways, to let hope back into my life without handing over my sanctuary. We had lunches where the conversation circled like wary swans. We had phone calls where she filled me in on in-law dinners and on Devon's penchant for collecting foreign spoons. We had silences, too, sometimes loaded, sometimes comfortable. The clause in my will functioned like a conversation starter with legal weight rather than a cudgel. It gave Hope the space to show I mattered enough for her to reflect. She sent another letter several months later. It was longer, more considered. She spoke of the pink letter she had written at 18, how she had understood it then as a promise, and how the world had been different and more complicated than a promise could hold. She acknowledged that in choosing how to present her life now, her wedding, her new family, she had made a choice that unwittingly pushed me out. She named the pain she caused and what she was willing to do to mend it: regular visits, inclusion in family events, and, perhaps more importantly, the work to understand how to be present without taking the central place in my life. That letter carried with it a tenderness that had taken her months to grow. I read it on the balcony one morning with the light a pale sweetness, and when I set the paper down, I felt like someone had slid a bridge across a narrow but fast stream. It did not mean everything was fixed. Bridges can need bracing, but I could feel a tremor of hope under my feet. The legacy became my life in the way that new neighborhoods become dear, gradually and insistently. I volunteered at the community garden where Mrs. Eleanor taught me the way to coax a stubborn tomato plant into giving fruit. I taught a mending circle on Wednesdays, little repairs that could make an old sweater presentable again, and could, in the process, remake a woman's day. Mr. Fernando sometimes stopped by for a lecture the residents had on managing your money in retirement. He would sit in the back with his hands folded and tell stories about the dogwoods, leaning like old women gossiping. It pleased me to see someone who had helped me in the earlier days now become part of my new ordinary. There were moments I didn't expect. A small victory when the knitting I began became a full scarf that Mrs. Mercedes claimed as her own. A surprising delight when a neighbor gave me half of her Pekin Danish because she thought she couldn't eat it all. Evenings seduced me into sitting on the balcony with a cup and watching the stars be patient. Once, Hope surprised me by bringing a small plate of the mac and cheese I'd once baked for holidays. It was as if she wanted to show that she remembered the recipes loss could not take. Not everything smoothed. There were visits when she arrived flustered and left apologetic, where her anxieties unclipped and fell on me like rain. There were days when I read the pink letter and felt a hollow longing that some promises do not keep. There were the nights when the silence of absent phone calls felt like a weight in my palm. Mostly, though, there was a steadying rhythm. I went to the quilt circle, I paid my bills with Mr. Fernando's help, I chatted at lunch with a man named Thomas who had the gall to insist I try the lemon bars. The minutes of my day filled with tasks I chose, not chores I had been born to. Legal details occasionally surfaced like reminders that I had done the responsible thing. Mr. Sanders called once to confirm that Hope's longer letter probably satisfied the clause in spirit and in letter. "It's a good faith effort," he said over the phone, his voice that reliable penumbra. "Legally, it's defensible, and more important, it's restorative. It gives you room to choose how to respond." I told him I appreciated his work like you appreciate a physician who steered you clear of danger. "You did the right steps," he said, "and you did them for yourself." Little celebrations came like unexpected guests. The first birthday in the legacy I did not spend alone. We had a small cake and a chorus of clapping from people who had only met me weeks earlier, but who knew the names of my scars. I wore a dress that Auntie Rosa liked, and a hat that didn't try too hard. Devon stopped by with a bouquet of sunflowers from the farmer's market, an awkward but earnest offering, and Hope sent a note with them that said simply, "For the woman who taught me how to tie a bow." I kept the sunflowers in a jar on the balcony and watched their heads bow like a congregation. Summer slid toward autumn, and the magnolia leaves took on a late warmth in my memory. The sale of the house became a story I could tell simply, like an event in a life that had plumbing and clear registers. I paid Mr. Fernando another visit to confirm the accounts were as we had planned. The proceeds were set aside in a way that made me breathless to look at. Enough to be comfortable, enough to fund the charitable gifts I wanted to make to the food pantry and to the program Auntie Rosa loved. I felt satisfaction in watching the numbers line up the way someone straightens a row of canned goods in a pantry. That was practicality and poetry both. The most delicate moments were the ones where Hope and I tried to reinvent rituals. We created new holidays, small, made-up gatherings where she brought over a plate, or I invited her to a lecture at the Legacy. Once, we baked a small batch of pecan Danish together in the communal kitchen, and she asked to learn the exact ratio of sugar to butter that made my version sing. I let her in on it, and as we did, the kitchen filled with a smell that could be pressed as memory into the top shelf of nostalgia. She hummed while she rolled the dough, and I watched her the way one watches a child tied to a kite string, roots visible through a tender wind. People ask me sometimes if I regret selling the house. Regret is a long, barbed thing. There are days when I miss the squeak of the stairs, the way the hallway remembered the sound of slippers, the nook in the magnolia room where I used to sit with Hope's schoolbooks. But regret is not the only word. There is also relief, a quiet liberation that does not always have fireworks attached. I had to give up a place to make room for myself. That truth sounds paradoxical only until you have tried both sides. Hope grew steadier. Devon settled into his place with a gentleness that had been hidden when we first met him on the porch. He came to the garden occasionally and complained that he killed everything he touched, but then sat at the barbecue and charred corn in a way that made everyone laugh. They invited me to dinner more than once. I went sometimes, and at other times I did not. I kept the boundaries I had set not as a wall, but as a frame, clear and necessary. There came a day, several months after the closing, when Hope and Devon brought someone else with them, an older woman with a shy smile. It was one of Devon's aunts, someone who had known Hope from the early months and wanted to meet the woman who had raised her. We sat in the Legacy sunroom over tea, and she asked questions about how Hope had been as a child. She was always stubborn, I told her, in that way of true love that finds humor in difficulty. She still is, but sometimes stubbornness changes shape and becomes courage. When I think about why selling the house felt like such a rupture, I think of houses as repositories, not just of things, but of roles. For years I had been the one who would always be there. That role is syrup thick, slow to unstick from someone's hands. By selling the house, I took down one of those signs. Some people saw that as punishment. I saw it as a chance to invite a new kind of relationship, where proximity was not a substitute for presence. There were awkward moments, of course. Once a neighbor's child, in that sweet bluntness of youth, asked what had happened to our old house. Ms. Harrison moved, I told her. She moved to a place with lots of friendly people. She shook her head. Did your daughter not like it? She asked, with the eternal logic children have. I said nothing for a moment before replying, people do what they think they need to do. Sometimes they remember. Sometimes they learn later. Her face registered the complexity like a future she would someday need to navigate. As the months unfolded, small rituals knitted my days together in their own pattern. I wrote in the notebook sometimes, short lists, small goals, a record of the books I wanted to read. I made 2 appointments a week, a walk in the park and a tea with a friend. I learned to count kindness in the currency of small mercies. A neighbor bringing over soup, Mr. Davis bringing wood for the communal fireplace, a letter from a woman in the city who had read about my sale in a local paper and wrote to say she admired my courage. Hope's letters continued to come, and they matured. In one, she told me about a moment where she had gone through some of the photos of the house before it sold, and had cried, not only for what she had placed in the past, but at the realization she had kept me out, because she was afraid of mixing her old identity with her new one. I am sorry I made the choice to exclude you, she wrote. It was cowardice more than courage. I want to do better. Cowardice, I told Auntie Rosa when I read that aloud, is a useful admission. She laughed the big laugh that feels like a church bell. Courage sometimes looks like apology, she said, and sometimes it looks like doing the right thing when it's hard. There was a time when I thought the sale might close the book on our family history. Instead, it turned the page. The story continued, but on different terms. Hope learned that love sometimes requires you to be present in a quiet, steady way rather than dramatic. I learned that protecting my dignity was not the same as shutting the door. We both learned the hard business of recrafting expectations. On a late autumn afternoon, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and the notebook balanced on my knees. The sky had that transparent quality the South sometimes gets before winter, thin and hopeful. A small boy down below chased a kite that had escaped its string. Mr. Fernando came out for his walk and tipped his hat. Later he would lecture to 30 people about the virtues of planning, and they would listen because at least one person in the room had put together an estate plan that didn't tie their heart in knots. My phone buzzed. It was a short message from Hope. "Would you like to come over for Sunday lunch? We made your mac and cheese." I sat with the message like someone considering an invitation to a river crossing. I replied, "I'll come. I will bring the pecan Danish." It felt like a small and honest victory. We had Sunday lunch, and it was quieter than the holidays had ever been, but gentler for the lack of spectacle. The children, if there were any yet in their circle, did not exist, and I did not invent them. There is a liberation in staying truthful to the facts and letting imagination not outrun what is. We shared food I had once made every holiday without complaint. We spoke of the future without planning it in excruciating detail. We spoke of old quilts and the magnolia tree and the way the light fell on the porch. There was no dramatic reconciliation scene, no movie-worthy embrace. There was an honest conversation about how we might proceed. Visits every other week, check-ins by phone, invitations to family events that included notice. Hope asked what she could do to make amends beyond words. I told her, and it was simple. Show up, be present, tell me when things change. She nodded with the kind of earnestness that age had taught her. "I can do that," she said. 6 months after the closing, I wrote the final line in the notebook for that season. "Balcony coffee, done." It was a small entry, a punctuation mark. The wooden trunk lived at the foot of my bed in my room at the Legacy. Sometimes I opened it and took out the pink letter and read it as one reads a map to a younger self. Other times I let it rest. Both documents present like two sides of the same coin. Hope's reflective letter, her second one, passed Mr. Sanders's reasonable test. He called to tell me the clause had performed the way I had hoped, as an opening rather than an executioner of relationships. "You've used the law to invite dialogue," he said. "That's not a common thing. People use law to shut doors. You used it as a window." I liked that metaphor. Windows let light in. Doors can be locked or opened. I had done both in my time. One afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor hugged me tight in front of the common room and said, "You deserve this peace, child. You did something brave for yourself." I felt my face go warm at the compliment. Courage, I learned, is not always the public flash of a hero. Often it is the slow accumulation of choices that honor the self. The Legacy continued to give me things I hadn't anticipated. Friendships that were steadfast without being needy. Laughter that didn't demand an explanation. An afternoon every week where someone would bring in a record player and we would listen to old songs and call each voice by name. Mrs. Mercedes and I began a small tradition of baking a tray of pecan Danish every month and giving them to people who seemed to have forgotten how sweet life can be. The pecan Danish, that little motif of loss and comfort, had found a new place. Now, when I think about the day my phone slipped out of my hand and the wedding photo glowed up at me like a small betrayal, I no longer carry that sting as the center of my life. It remains part of the story, the thud of the phone, the pecan Danish crumbs, the trunk pulled open, and the scent of lavender. But it is not the thing that defines who I am. I learned to name the hurt, and then to make choices that honored my dignity. I sold the house because it was mine to sell, and because the proceeds could secure me a life where I would not be at the mercy of silence. Hope and I are not restored to what we once were. Instead, we are learning to be people who have made decisions and now must live with them in generosity or in careful distance. That is an adult kind of love. Patient, demanding, and messy. Sometimes she calls and leaves a message of 3 words that make my chest bloom. Sometimes she forgets a call, and I breathe through the disappointment. But there is a new pattern of presence, and that is progress. A short while ago, I tucked a fresh napkin into my handbag and walked to the mailbox to send a donation to the food pantry I had designated in my will. I put a note inside telling them to use the funds for the children's program Auntie Rosa loves. I felt a sensation like setting a bird free, nervous and hopeful. Later, I sat with a cup of coffee on the balcony and watched a woman below hang laundry that flapped like small flags of a life in motion. I thought of my trunk, my notebook, the closing table where my pen had made that resolute inked line. I thought of Hope's second letter and the way it had sounded like a promise grown up. Not everyone will understand why I sold the house. Some will call it harsh. Others might call it the saving of myself. I don't live for verdicts. I live now by the slower currency of peace. There is a hard-earned calm to being where you are, doing the work of belonging on your own terms. For me, that work included legal counsel and careful financial planning. It included the finality of a closing table and the humility to accept that some bridges need construction and others need crossing. If you have ever felt invisible in the life of someone you love, know that there are ways to set boundaries without burning bridges into ash. You can consult, plan, and choose. You can be kind and still be firm. You can ask for a conversation to happen before a bequest is unlocked. You can, in short, love yourself into existence. Auntie Rosa still says, "Good girl," the way a chorus repeats a refrain. Mr. Fernando stops by for lectures, and Mr. Sanders still keeps his pen poised for the next sensible plan. Mrs. Eleanor pats my hand like a daily benediction. Mrs. Mercedes brings me pecan Danish as if no time had passed. Mr. Alexander Davis plays me a quiet song on his radio and says that he is glad I took the step. Hope sends messages that sometimes arrive like a warm hand in the dark and sometimes like a promise still being stitched. That is the truth. Life returns in pieces, and sometimes we get to hold them and say, "I will make something of this." There is a final image I keep close. It is of the balcony one morning, coffee steaming, the notebook open to a blank page and my pen poised. The page does not scare me now. It invites. It asks what I will write next. What friendships, what small rituals, what kindnesses will compose the rest of my days. Selling the house was not the end of my story. It was a renovation of my life plan, a choice to build a daily world I could live in with dignity. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been left out of a family's moment, or have had to reclaim your life in a quiet, steady way, I hope you'll come back for another true life story that honors the same things: dignity, courage, and the small mercies that make new days possible. Subscribe for more stories like mine, and if you know someone who needs to hear that it's possible to choose oneself and live kindly afterward, share this with them. Thank you for sitting here with me.